This time on Finnegan's Garage, it's tips and tricks for building your first engine. This is a brand new all-aluminum Brodix Big Block Chevy. This is the same engine block Boshears and I weighed here in the garage and compared against an old school cast iron Mark IV Big Block Chevy. And right now I'm going to show you how to check bearing clearances and just a few other things you want to do to a brand new engine block or a used one before you try to put it together. First thing I do before I build any engine, and that's whether the parts came from a machine shop, whether it's a used block, a brand new engine block, any engine, I clean it. And I will clean it 3 more times throughout the build. But before I measure anything, mock up anything, I'm going to clean this thing as well as I can, inside and out, so that when I turn it over like this, stuff doesn't come falling out of the bolt holes and land in brand new parts. Because what you don't want is dirt, grease, anything landing in a fresh build, because most engine damage, short of having a catastrophic failure, happens when you fire the engine. And the first time you fire a brand new build or a rebuild, that's when a lot of wear can occur. Right now we're going to clean this thing with all these bottle brushes. They come in various sizes. This is a kit. I bought this from Moroso. Really inexpensive, but every one is a perfect size to clean out a hole in this. Whether it's a lifter bore, a cylinder bore, a boat hole, an oil gallery, there's a brush for it. And then I'm going to use simple green when I do the job. This works pretty well. You can cut it with water or go full strength, depending on how dirty your thing is. When I'm all done, I'm going to quickly wipe the bores down with WD-40. Just a light rub, because I live in Georgia, it's moist here. Stuff starts rusting immediately. And although this is a aluminum engine block, the cylinder liners are cast iron and they will rust quickly. So here we go. I'm going to clean out everything I can right now, blow this thing out with air, bring it back inside the garage, and then I'm going to start measuring bearing clearances, and that's what we'll talk about next. Now before I install any of these main caps, I'm going to clean them too, and that's because these are all shipped with a coating of, I think, oil on them, for lack of a better term, and so they're actually dirty when you get them, so it's a good idea to clean them. Rather than use brake clean or anything like that, I'm just going to use some mineral spirits here. This is a good way to clean stuff, because it really doesn't leave a film on the part afterwards. And if you don't have a parts washer at home, just a drain pan like this that you're sure is clean inside and out. A little mineral spirit, brush, some gloves to keep the stuff off you, and you can make a place to wash your parts, even if it's technically not a parts washer. If you look at the middle of the pan, you can see where the mineral spirits have settled, and see how it's kind of yellowish brown. That's all the oil that came off of these parts. And then if you look at the outer edge of the pan where it's lighter colored, almost kind of a silver, like the natural look of the pan, that's wet. It's just that's the clean part of the pan. So It's a good idea to wash everything, because there was oil on there, and if there's oil on a part, that means there's dirt stuck to that oil. And we don't want dirt in our motor. Well, the engine is back in the shop. It's been deburred, it's been cleaned, it's been dried. All of the cylinder liners, which are made of cast iron, have been wiped down to prevent them from rusting. You might assume this thing's ready to assemble, except it's not. Now, every single part going into this engine is brand new, and I'm still going to make the assumption that most of them don't fit. Probably wrong, but I'm going to assume they don't. Why? Well, everything is important. All of the clearances between all of these parts are important. This is a brand new crankshaft from Lunati Performance. Really, really nice piece. The machine work is amazing, the polish job is great. I'm going to assume my balancer is not going to slide right on there. I'm going to assume my crank gear isn't going to fit. I'm going to assume the bearings I bought might not give me the right oil clearance between the journals and the block. Why do I do that? I do that because when I assemble it and I push the start button, I don't want everything to come to a screeching halt. I also do that because, well, this gives me peace of mind, assuming everything's wrong, because then I can go and measure it and make sure it's right before I put it together. That way, as soon as I push the start button, it roars to life, it's all good, high five my buddies, give this engine to my friend. So, how are we going to verify that the parts we've bought fit together before we final assemble the engine? Well, we have measuring tools. This is called an outside micrometer. This is what I'm going to use to measure all of the journals on this crankshaft. The main journals, which there's 5 of them on a Big Block Chevy, and the rod journals, there's 4 of them. A pair of rods goes on each one of these rod journals. These should be machined to a specific dimension. The journals inside of the engine block are bored to a specific dimension. When you add the right size bearing inside of the block, there should be an oil clearance between that journal and that bearing. Now on rods, I like to shoot for about 2/1000ths of an inch. On mains, I go a little more. 3/1000ths of an inch, I'm fine with it. And I'm going to measure every single one of these. I'm going to install all the bearings in the block, torque all the main caps, torque all the rods, and I'm going to measure everything and find out, do I have the dimensions I'm looking for? If I don't, we need to adjust. If I do, we can take everything back apart, finish mocking up the rest of the engine, clean it again, then we're ready for final assembly. So once I've measured all of my journals, I'll write all of the measurements down, that way I can refer to them later, okay? But what I like to do, and this is a surefire way to find out the oil clearances of your bearings, is I'll do one at a time, okay? So I'll measure this rod journal, right? I will leave my micrometer locked in place for this measurement. Then I'll take this and I'll set my dial bore gauge to this measurement right here, okay? Then I'll go assemble a connecting rod with the bearings intact. I'll put my dial bore gauge, which will be zeroed to this, inside of the rod. Whatever that number I get is my oil clearance. There are people out there that can do this with math. They'll measure the rod journal diameter, they'll measure the housing bore diameter in the rod, then they'll measure the thickness of the bearing shell, and they'll compute the oil clearance. And you can do that. You can use Plastigauge. There's a number of ways to do this. But what works best for me, and which satisfies my peace of mind, is physically measuring the journal, installing the bearing in the rod, torquing it to spec, and then putting my dial bore gauge inside of it and finding out the gap. If I have it, great. If I don't, time to adjust. Here's an up-close look at what I was talking about. Got our outside micrometer, rod journal. The way I like to do this is I will open up the instrument wider than the journal. Then I will slide it over the journal, and with my left hand, I'm going to push this end of the micrometer into the journal, which will make it pretty much square. With my right, I'm going to tighten down the micrometer, and when I get close, I'm going to wiggle it up and down just a little bit as I tighten it. Once it stops wiggling, I know it's square. Click it 3 times on the end, lock the measurement, slide it off. Now I can compute my distance from here to here. I know this is more than 2 inches, According to this, we've gone 2 inches, 100 thousandths. I see 3 hash marks going this way, so that's 175. We're past the 20 thousandths mark, so that's 175 plus 20 is 195, 96, 97, 98, 99. So 2 inches, 199 thousandths plus, we'll rotate this and figure out where we line up, 0. So 2 inches, 199 thousandths. That is the diameter of this journal in the location I measured. Now I'm going to measure it here and here just to make sure that there's no taper in it, because a pair of rods will ride on this. So if this side of it is, 2 inches, 199 thousandths, but this side is 2 inch, 205 thousandths, the clearance for this one obviously will be different than this one. And ideally these be the same, and we'd use the same kind of bearing in here. There are oil galleries in every journal on this crank, in every throw, in every main journal. So when you install the outside micrometer onto the journal, you want to be careful not to put either edge in one of these holes, because obviously then your measurement's not on a round object and it will be incorrect. So I try to go perpendicular to those holes if possible. Let's talk about our connecting rods. These are by Bullet. This is an off-the-shelf lineup of rods from Carrillo. Same forging that you get when you order a custom Carrillo connecting rod, 4330. These are shot peened. These are ground and weighed to within 1 gram of each other. That means every rod out of all 8 will weigh within 1 gram of the next one. Makes it easier to balance your rotating assembly. They have bronze bushings, they have WMC fasteners. Everything about this rod says throw whatever you want at it, it's not going to break in half. And before I put it in the engine and before I start measuring oil clearances, I'm going to engrave the number 8 into the cap and the bottom of the rod. That's for cylinder number 8. Later on, if I have to take the engine apart, I can quickly look at this and know which hole did this come out of. It's important. So I have a cheapy Harbor Freight. Well, it's not cheapy. It's inexpensive, and it came from Harbor Freight. This is my engraver. Safety first. Put my glasses on here. We're just going to quickly put the number 8 in this rod. Note the incredible penmanship, even with an engraver. Yeah, that's why I'm not a doctor, because it looks that good. After engraving the rod, I set up my rod vise right here. This is my regular old bench vise. The rod vise came from Proform. I've had this thing about 10 years. I really only use it to hold connecting rods. It's made out of aluminum. It's spring-loaded, which is nice because it makes it much faster to assemble and disassemble things. The rods come pre-assembled, so the first thing I'm going to do is tighten it down in the vise with the parting line past the end of the vise. And then I'm going to loosen all the fasteners. Then I'm going to slide the rod backwards until the cap is under the vise, but the arm of the rod is out, and I'm going to wiggle it and separate the cap from the body of the connecting rod. See that there? Now it's time to make sure these are clean and slide in our bearing shells. So our connecting rod goes back in our rod vise. Note the parting line of the rod is outside of the vise. That way the vise is holding the bulk of the rod, but as we tighten the bolts, this can go together. If the parting line was under here and you try to tighten the bolts, obviously that wouldn't work out too well. Carrillo sends this fastener lube that is designed to go on the threads and beneath the head of the bolt, so that as you're torquing the bolt in place and as you're measuring how much stretch you're achieving on the bolt, the friction is reduced and you get the right torque reading. I've already measured the bolt stretch for these, and I know that it takes approximately 70 foot-pounds of torque for these bolts to stretch about 5.5 thousandths of an inch. And when they stretch that far, you have the proper clamping load to keep that connecting rod together when you wing this thing 8,000 RPM. Alright, bearings are installed, bolts are torqued. Now we can measure our oil clearance. So the next step is to take our measurement of our journal, which is represented here with our micrometer. This is locked, so it can't move. And I need to set our dial bore gauge against this as the standard. The easiest way I've found to do that is to hold this gently in a vise. I have these rubber soft jaws. I'm going to slide them in there. The reason I do that is so that when I tighten this down gently by using the rubber soft jaws, it doesn't distort the body of the micrometer, and it maintains the measurement. Dial bore gauge. This one is not very expensive. I think I bought this from Summit Racing. It says Phase 2 on it. I think it's marketed under a couple of different names, but this one I believe is from Powerhouse Tools. Then I set up my dial bore gauge, slide it in here, just like that, and we need to zero this. Okay, so we're going to wiggle it around, find the highest reading, and whenever we get to the highest reading, which it looks like is right about there, we're going to move that over so that our highest reading, the widest part, is our zero mark on our gauge. Once we establish our zero, when we install the dial bore gauge into our bearing inside of our connecting rod, it will tell us how much larger the opening in the bearing was versus the outside diameter of our journal. And that is our oil clearance. I've already set this up, zeroed it to the micrometer. In theory, when I install this inside of the bearing and the connecting rod, this should show somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 thousandths oil clearance. On rods in an engine like this, I try to find somewhere around 2 thousandths of an inch. If it's a hair under that or a hair over that, it's fine. The engine will live. So here we go. We're going to install it in the middle of the bearing shell, 90 degrees to the parting line. And I'll turn this so that hopefully you guys can see it. And we're going to move it forward and backward, and we're going to watch the needle and find the highest reading. So if you look right there, every line is half a thou. So we're the fourth line out, that's 2 thousandths of an inch. Right on the money. And just because I'm curious if this thing is round or not, we're going to measure it at about 45 degrees to the parting line and see what we get. It's a little more than 2.5 thou. So it's not 100% round, which is fairly common. I've seen this in almost every engine I've ever built. So Bo Shears just schooled me on something. I always noticed with every engine I've ever assembled that near the parting line, the measurement was always bigger than it was 90 degrees to the parting line, and I always thought that's interesting. It's not actually round. And Bo Shears just explained to me why it's not round. It's on purpose.
Look at this rod bearing in a dial bore gauge is the way Mike was just measuring. They're going to measure roughly 1 thousandths wider at the part line than they are vertically. And that's so if they were to come together and the clearance was to take up, there's some clearance room at the part line, because this technically is the weakest point of a rod. Usually if they're destroyed or anything, they're not actually compressed to break, or they don't snap. They usually are pulled in two, and when you stretch this rod, it's going to get narrower at this point. So the bearing actually is made to not be perfectly round. The housing bore, on the other hand, needs to be perfectly round in all points, but the bearing itself is designed to have a little more clearance at the part line.
Hell yeah, I learned something new today. Here we go. Going to check our main bearing oil clearance. This is going to work just the same as our rod bearing oil clearance. Bearing shell upper and lower are in place. Cap is on. Bolts are torqued to spec. Actually, these are studs, but whatever. These are torqued. Bearing is crushed in there. Our dial bore gauge was zeroed off of an outside micrometer. That outside micrometer was locked in place on the number 1 journal of the crankshaft. And our dial bore gauge says we're right at about 4,000ths of an inch oil clearance. Now, 4,000ths of an inch on a big block Chevy that the customer is probably going to run 7,000 RPM, it's a little more than I'd like to see. You know, our goal was to run 1030 motor oil in this, 1040, somewhere in there, and I'll usually set these at about 3,000ths of an inch. I mean, we're splitting hairs here. It's not that big of a difference, 3,000ths to 4,000ths. There are racing engines out there that run 5,000ths of an inch. You know, they run thicker weight oil, but you can do it. I'll probably change out half of these bearings. This is a standard set of bearings in here yielding that 4,000ths of an inch. I'll probably change one shell, either the top or the bottom, to an undersized bearing. They make them in 1,000ths sets. So if I was to take a 1,000ths set bearing and put half of it in here, that should add a half thou clearance to our measurements. So instead of having 4,000ths in here, we'd have 3.5. You know, if we put both 1,000ths undersized bearings in there, in theory, this thing should be 3,000ths of an inch. At the beginning of this video, I told you to not assume anything fits. Nothing. Check everything. That includes even the smallest of parts, the most insignificant, the things that you think, there's no way this won't fit. Like the rear main seal. Look right there at the parting line, and you'll notice there's a flat spot on the inside diameter of the seal. It's not round there. Why? Because it's being crushed too much by the main cap. There's too much material right here. So when the main cap got torqued down, that squeezed together and that deformed the inside edge. What's going to happen because of that? If I were to install it like this, put the crankshaft in there, assemble the motor, and fire it up, it would probably weep oil right there around the back of the crankshaft. And instead of sealing it to the journal like it's supposed to, it'd probably just weep oil and we'd have an oil leak. So what we have to do, thankfully we caught this when we mocked it up, is take the cap back out, take the seal back out, remove some of the material at the parting line on both sides, crush it down again when we torque the cap, and see if it stays round. This is just one of many pieces we will stare at, mock up, and fiddle with before we ever permanently assemble the engine. It's all in the details.